I should have listened to my grandfather growing up in rural Arizona. I heard plenty of stories about the desert. My grandfather, a proud Diné elder, often spoke about the land with a reverence that I, as a naive teenager, couldn't quite understand. He'd warn me about wandering too far after dark, about the spirits that moved in the shadows, and about the Skinwalkers, those who had chosen to forsake their humanity in exchange for unspeakable power. Back then, I rolled my eyes and chalked it all up to folklore. Now, I wish I had listened. Last summer, my best friend Nate invited me and a few others to spend a weekend at his family's property near the edge of the Navajo Nation. The place wasn't much, a rundown trailer surrounded by miles of untouched desert. But the isolation made it perfect for late-night bonfires and drinking sessions where no one could hear us being reckless. Nate swore the stars looked brighter out there, and with no cell reception, it was the kind of getaway we all needed. The first night was uneventful. We arrived late, piled out of Nate's beat-up truck, and immediately set to work starting a fire. The desert cooled quickly after sunset, and we huddled close, laughing and trading stories. Somewhere between the second and third beers, Nate brought up the Skinwalker legend. "Man, my grandma used to swear they're real," he said, tossing another log onto the fire. The flames crackled and sent sparks into the inky sky. She'd say they were witches, people who could take on animal forms, like coyotes or owls. Creepy, huh? "Oh, come on," said Beth, one of the girls from our group. "That's just to scare kids, right?" "Yeah," I added, feeling bold. "What's next, the chupacabra?" Nate grinned, but his eyes flicked toward the dark horizon just for a moment. "Laugh if you want, but out here people don't mess with that stuff. You hear something weird, you see something off, you don't look too long, and you definitely don't follow it." The conversation moved on, but something about Nate's tone stuck with me. There was a seriousness beneath his usual laid-back attitude, a weight to his words that I couldn't shake. The first sign of trouble came the following evening. "How's that for the opening? If you're happy with the tone and pacing, I'll continue with the story and build toward the eerie encounters." The first sign of trouble came the following evening. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than I expected, painting the desert in hues of deep orange and violet. As the light faded, the air grew colder, sharper, and the vast emptiness of the land pressed against us. Nate was right. The stars here did seem brighter, but instead of feeling awe, I felt exposed, as if the heavens were staring back at me. We decided to go for a short walk before starting the fire. Nate insisted we stick together, and though he didn't say why, none of us argued. The desert at night was eerie in a way I hadn't anticipated. Every sound carried farther than it should, the crunch of our boots on the gravel, the occasional skitter of something unseen in the brush. "Hey, check this out," Nate said, his voice low. He pointed to the ground, where the dirt was uneven, disturbed. "What is it?" Beth asked, stepping closer. "Tracks. Large ones. They resembled coyote prints, but they were wrong. Too big. The shape wasn't quite right either. The pads were elongated, and the claw marks seemed deliberate, almost human." "That's not a coyote," I said, trying to sound confident, but my voice cracked slightly. Nate didn't respond. Instead, he stood there, staring at the tracks with a furrowed brow. "We should head back," he finally said. "Why? It's probably just a big dog or something," Sarah, the other girl in our group, said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Just trust me," Nate muttered, already turning back toward the trailer. The fire was smaller that night, and the mood had shifted. Even the beer didn't seem to help. Beth kept glancing over her shoulder. Sarah was unusually quiet, and Nate stared into the flames, jaw clenched. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked suddenly. Everyone froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire. Then, faintly, a sound carried on the wind, a high-pitched whistling, rhythmic and deliberate. It came from the direction of the tracks. "That's just the wind," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Wind doesn't sound like that," Nate replied. The whistling grew louder, closer, and then stopped altogether. We all held our breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of our hearts. Then came the laugh. It was low and guttural, like the rasp of someone who hadn't spoken in years. It echoed across the desert, sending a chill through me so intense I nearly dropped my beer. "Inside. Now," Nate ordered. We didn't argue. The trailer felt safer, but not by much. The thin walls did little to block out the night, and every creak and groan of the structure set us on edge. Nate locked the door and pulled the blinds, his movements quick and deliberate. "What the hell was that?" Beth whispered. Nate hesitated before answering. "You don't want to know." "Don't give me that crap," I snapped. "You've been acting weird ever since we got here. What's going on?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "My family's been on this land for generations. I've heard stories, things my grandparents swore were true. Skinwalkers aren't just legends, man. They're real, and we just stepped into their territory." Beth scoffed, but her voice wavered. "You're joking, right? Tell me you're joking." Nate didn't respond. The silence was broken by a thud on the roof. We all jumped, staring up at the ceiling as if it would suddenly collapse. The sound came again, heavier this time, as if something was walking across the trailer. "Turn off the lights," Nate whispered. Sarah reached for the switch, her hands shaking so badly she fumbled it twice before plunging us into darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Then came the scratching. It started at the far end of the trailer, slow and deliberate, moving toward us. Whatever it was, it dragged its claws along the metal siding, the sound grating and unnatural. Beth started to cry softly, and I couldn't blame her. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. "Don't make a sound," Nate whispered. The scratching stopped. Then, from just outside the window, we heard it. "Help me." The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something off about it. The cadence was wrong, the pitch too high. It was like someone imitating a human voice, but not quite getting it right. "Don't look," Nate hissed, but I couldn't help myself. I turned toward the window, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. A face, pale and distorted, with eyes that burned like embers. It grinned at me, its teeth sharp and glinting in the faint light of the moon. I stumbled back, heart in my throat, and the thing outside let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a laugh. It began pounding on the walls, moving faster than should have been possible, its blows so strong the trailer shook. "We have to leave," Sarah cried, but Nate shook his head violently. "Number, if we run, it'll follow us." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the chaos. Nate's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We wait, and we pray it loses interest." The pounding continued for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We stayed huddled together in the dark, too terrified to move or speak. Outside, the desert was silent, and then, just as I was beginning to think it was over, the voice came again. "Help me." But this time it wasn't outside. It was coming from the hallway. The voice echoed through the cramped trailer, a chilling mimicry of humanity that froze the blood in our veins. "Help me." It sounded closer now, coming from somewhere deeper inside the trailer. The hallway was dark, its shadows stretching and twisting like they had a life of their own. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The doors are locked. The windows are shut. How?" Nate put a finger to his lips, silencing her. His eyes darted toward the hallway, and he motioned for us to stay quiet. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me. Please." I could hear the faint scrape of something dragging along the floor, moving closer with every passing second. "Stay here," Nate mouthed, though his face betrayed the fear he was trying to suppress. Before we could stop him, he grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stepped into the hallway. "Are you insane?" I hissed, but he didn't respond. We watched as the beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow corridor. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft creak of the floor beneath his boots. Then the flashlight flickered. Nate stopped dead in his tracks. "Nate?" Beth called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The flashlight flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the hallway into darkness. "Nate!" I shouted, bolting to my feet. Before I could reach him, the hallway erupted in chaos. A guttural roar filled the air, so loud it rattled the walls. Nate screamed, a raw, primal sound that sent chills down my spine. Then came the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Nate!" I yelled again, but he was gone. Beth and Sarah were crying now, their sobs muffled by the hands they'd pressed to their mouths. "What do we do?" Beth asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. For the next hour, we sat in silence, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. Every creak of the trailer, every gust of wind against the walls made us jump. Then, from outside, we heard the laughter again. It was deep and guttural, echoing across the desert. But this time, it wasn't alone. Other voices joined in, overlapping in a discordant symphony of terror. Some were high-pitched and wheezing, others low and rumbling, but they all had the same unnatural quality, like they were mocking us. "They're surrounding us," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Beth began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as if the fear itself was suffocating her. "We can't stay here," I said finally, my voice shaking. "How do we even get out?" Beth asked. "They're everywhere." I didn't have an answer. The laughter grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from just outside the door. Then, without warning, the trailer shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah and Beth by the arms and dragging them toward the door. We burst outside, the cold night air hitting us like a slap in the face. For a moment, everything was eerily quiet. The desert stretched out before us, vast and empty under the pale light of the moon. Then we saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms shifting and contorting as they moved. Some crawled on all fours, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, while others stood tall and gaunt, their glowing eyes fixed on us. They were everywhere, encircling us, cutting off any chance of escape. "We're not going to make it," Beth whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, we are," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. I tightened my grip on their arms and bolted toward the car, praying it wasn't too far. The creatures followed, their movements impossibly fast and fluid. I could hear them behind us, their guttural growls and gutted laughter mixing with the sound of our panicked breaths. We reached the car just as one of them lunged. Its clawed hand scraped against my back, tearing through my shirt and leaving a searing pain in its wake. "Go!" I shouted, shoving Beth and Sarah into the car. I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car sped down the dirt road, its tires kicking up clouds of dust. In the rearview mirror, I saw them, the creatures, standing in the middle of the road. They didn't chase us. They just watched, their glowing eyes burning into me even as the distance between us grew. But the laughter followed us. We didn't stop driving until we reached the highway. Even then, we didn't feel safe. Beth and Sarah sat in silence, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. We never found Nate. We reported him missing, of course, but the authorities didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. I haven't been back to the desert since. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the laughter. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. I don't know if it's real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But one thing is certain. The legends are true. The Skinwalkers are real. And they're still out there, watching, waiting. So if you ever find yourself in the vast, empty desert, and you hear a voice calling out to you from the darkness, don't stop. Don't look. And whatever you do, don't answer. Growing up in rural Arizona, I heard countless tales of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches that haunted the edges of the reservation. My grandmother always warned me never to whistle after dark, never to stray too far from the house at dusk. I used to laugh it off, dismissing her warnings as superstition. Until last summer. I was home from college, visiting my family for a few weeks. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and crimson, I decided to go for a walk. I wasn't far from the house, just wandering the dirt trails I'd grown up on, enjoying the cool breeze. That's when I heard it. A faint whistle. At first, I thought it was just the wind slipping through the cacti, but it came again, clear and deliberate. It was a tune I didn't recognize, haunting and disjointed. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the horizon. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Silence. The whistle came again, this time from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the vast emptiness of the desert. My chest tightened as an unnatural chill crept up my spine. I decided it was time to head back. Picking up my pace, I kept my eyes on the house in the distance, its lights glowing faintly in the encroaching darkness. But the whistling didn't stop. It followed me, growing louder and closer with every step. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. A figure crouched low to the ground, just beyond the trail. At first glance, it looked like a coyote, its thin body silhouetted against the fading light. But as I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. The creature turned its head toward me, and I saw its face. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, or at least something trying to be. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its skull, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. It grinned at me, revealing jagged teeth. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature stood, its body contorting unnaturally as it rose to its full height. It let out a low, guttural sound that sent a wave of nausea through me. Then it started toward me. My paralysis broke, and I bolted for the house. The whistling turned into a cacophony of unearthly shrieks, echoing across the desert. I didn't dare look back, not even when I heard the pounding of footsteps behind me. I burst through the front door, slamming it shut and locking it. My grandmother was already there, her face pale. "You whistled, didn't you?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. I shook my head, too breathless to explain. She grabbed a bundle of sage from the shelf and began chanting under her breath, her voice trembling. Outside, the shrieking stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. For hours, we sat in the dimly lit living room, the air thick with the scent of burning sage. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, there were deep scratches on the front door, long gouges that couldn't have been made by any animal. I've never walked those trails again. And now, when the sun begins to set, I make sure to be inside, with the doors locked and the lights on, because I know they're still out there, waiting for someone foolish enough to whistle after dark. They always said the old dirt road leading to the canyon was cursed. The locals called it the Hollow Road, a desolate stretch of path flanked by untamed forest. People claimed strange things happened there. Cars stalling, headlights flickering, voices calling from the trees. But I didn't believe in curses, at least not until that night. It was supposed to be a quick trip. My friend Alex and I were heading back from a late-night hike in the hills. We'd lost track of time, and by the time we made it back to the car, the sun had long since set, leaving the forest shrouded in darkness. "Think we'll make it back before midnight?" Alex joked, his voice cutting through the silence. "Only if you stop making stupid jokes and let me drive," I shot back. The car's engine rumbled to life, and we started down the narrow road, the headlights carving a path through the inky blackness. The trees pressed in on either side, their gnarled branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. The air felt heavy, charged with an unexplainable tension. Even Alex, usually the loudest of the two of us, had gone quiet. About 10 minutes in, the first strange thing happened. A deer appeared on the side of the road, standing perfectly still. At first I thought it was normal, a deer caught in the headlights. But as we passed it, I noticed its head was turned to face us. Its eyes didn't reflect the light like they should have. They were dark, empty pits. "Did you see that?" I asked, glancing at Alex. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice uneasy. "That wasn't right." I pressed the gas a little harder, eager to put some distance between us and whatever that was. But the further we drove, the stranger things became. Shadows flitted across the road, too fast and too large to be animals. The radio, which had been playing softly in the background, started to crackle, the music fading in and out. Then came the voices. At first I thought I was imagining it. A faint whisper, so quiet I could barely make it out. But as we drove on, it grew louder, more distinct. "Help. Me." Alex turned to me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my grip tightening on the wheel. The whispering continued, weaving through the static of the radio. "Turn back," it said, the voice low and gravelly. "Keep driving," Alex said, his voice trembling. I didn't need to be told twice. The road twisted and turned, the trees seeming to close in around us. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. Shit! I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. For a moment, everything was silent. And then the scratching started. It came from all sides of the car, a faint grating sound like nails on metal. Alex fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight and shining it out the window. "Don't," I whispered, my heart pounding. But it was too late. The light caught something moving just beyond the glass. A face, pale and gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It pressed its hands against the window, its fingers long and clawed. "Drive!" Alex screamed. I didn't think. I just acted. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the accelerator, the car lurching forward. The creature let out an unearthly screech as we sped away, its form disappearing into the shadows. We thought we were in the clear, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. The forest grew denser, the trees casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. It was following us. The creature was running on all fours, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. Its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Faster!" Alex shouted, clutching the dashboard. "I'm trying," I yelled back, the car struggling to pick up speed on the uneven dirt road. The creature let out another screech, and suddenly, the car jolted violently to the side. It felt like something had hit us, but there was nothing in sight. "Keep going!" Alex urged, his voice cracking with fear. The forest seemed alive now, the trees swaying and groaning as if they were trying to trap us. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed a cacophony of voices. "You can't escape. Join us. Turn back." I gritted my teeth, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The car's engine roared as we sped down the road, the creature still in pursuit. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The forest fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as we burst out onto the highway. I didn't stop driving until we reached a gas station miles away. We stumbled out of the car, our legs shaky and our hearts pounding. Alex leaned against the hood, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. As I inspected the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Long, deep scratches ran down the sides, marks that couldn't have been made by anything human. The attendant at the gas station stared at us as we paid for gas. "You kids came from the Hollow Road, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. "How did you know?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. The man shook his head. "You're lucky you made it out. Not everyone does." We never went back to that road. And to this day, when I hear whispers in the night or see shadows moving just out of sight, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I never thought much about the old stories my grandfather used to tell. He'd sit on the porch, his weathered hands gripping a coffee mug, and speak in that gravelly voice of his. The stories were about skinwalkers, shapeshifters that could take on the form of animals, even people. They were tales of Navajo lore, whispered among the elders to keep the curious and the reckless from wandering too far into the unknown. To me, they were nothing more than campfire stories, something to make the Arizona nights feel a little more mysterious. That was until last weekend. I'm writing this now, locked in my bedroom with every light in the house turned on. My hands are shaking, and I haven't slept in 2 days. You might think I'm exaggerating or that this is some elaborate joke, but I swear to you, every word I'm about to write is true. Please, if you've ever heard the stories, if you've ever doubted them, let me be the warning that I ignored. It started with a simple camping trip. My girlfriend Emily, my best friend Jake, and his girlfriend Sarah had all decided to spend the weekend in a remote part of the desert. It wasn't supposed to be anything crazy. We'd found a spot about 30 miles from the nearest town, a secluded area surrounded by red rocks and endless skies. Jake had a truck packed with gear, and Emily had her Polaroid camera ready to capture every moment. The plan was to disconnect from the world for a couple of days, roast marshmallows, and enjoy the quiet. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The colors in the sky were breathtaking, oranges, purples, and reds that seemed to stretch on forever. We set up our tents, built a fire, and cracked open a few beers. Jake's Bluetooth speaker was playing some classic rock, and everything felt perfect. For a while, it was. We laughed, swapped stories, and watched the stars emerge one by one in the vast, unpolluted sky. But then came the sound. At first it was faint, almost like a distant animal call. A low, guttural howl that seemed to echo off the rocks. It didn't register as anything unusual. Coyotes are common in this area, and their cries can carry for miles. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, closer, more human. "What the hell is that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. She'd always been the most skeptical of us, the first to roll her eyes at anything remotely superstitious. But even she couldn't hide the unease creeping into her expression. "Probably just some animal," Jake said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness beyond our campsite. Nothing to worry about. The light swept over the scrub and rocks, illuminating nothing out of the ordinary. Still, that sound lingered in the air, a haunting wail that sent chills down my spine. Emily moved closer to me, her hand gripping mine tightly. "Maybe we should just call it a night," she whispered. I nodded, eager to put some distance between us and whatever was making that noise. We doused the fire, zipped ourselves into our tents, and tried to ignore the growing tension that seemed to hang over the campsite. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that sound again. Closer now, more insistent. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. The desert was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a coyote. It stood just at the edge of the firelight's reach, its silhouette tall and thin against the darkness. But something about it was off. Its limbs were too long, its posture too upright. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed an unnatural shade of yellow, like two burning coals staring right at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it let out that same chilling howl. Only this time, it was unmistakably human. "Jake," I hissed, backing away slowly. "Jake, wake up!" But before he could stir, the creature darted off into the darkness, its movements impossibly fast and fluid. I stood there, trembling, for what felt like an eternity before finally retreating to the tent. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told the others what I'd seen. Jake laughed it off, saying I must have been half asleep and imagining things. Emily looked concerned but didn't press the issue. Sarah, however, didn't say a word. She just stared at me, her face pale and drawn, like she'd seen a ghost. We decided to pack up and leave that afternoon, but not before taking a short hike to a nearby canyon. It was supposed to be a quick trip, just a way to stretch our legs before the long drive back. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every rustle of the bushes, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. Then we found the tracks. They were in a patch of soft dirt, deep and unmistakable. Large, human-like footprints, but with claws at the tips of the toes. Jake's confident facade cracked as he examined them, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What the hell made these?" he muttered. "I told you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's out there." "Okay, let's not panic," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "We'll just head back to the campsite, pack up, and get out of here. No big deal." But as we turned to leave, a low growl echoed through the canyon. It was close. Too close. The four of us froze, our eyes darting around in search of the source. And then we saw it again, perched on a rock high above us. The same gaunt figure, its glowing eyes locked onto us. But now, in the harsh light of day, its appearance was even more grotesque. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared, unblinking, as if daring us to run. "Go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Don't look back." We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, the creature's gaze burning into our backs the entire time. When we finally reached the campsite, we didn't waste a second. We threw our gear into the truck and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in our wake. But the nightmare didn't end there. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The same low howl, echoing through the night. And when I looked out the window, I saw them. Not one, but several figures, standing in the shadows just beyond the streetlight's reach. Their glowing eyes watched me, unblinking, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. They're everywhere now. I see them in the corners of my vision, hear their cries in the dead of night. I've tried everything, sage, salt, prayers, but nothing works. If you're reading this, please heed my warning. Stay away from the desert, stay away from the dark, and whatever you do, don't look into their eyes, because once they've marked you, there's no escape. If you're ever driving down Route 106 in Michigan and you see a sign for the Greenbrier Motel, you better just keep on driving, because there is something terribly wrong here, and the last thing I would want is for more people to die. I started working at the Greenbrier Motel a week ago. It wasn't a dream job by any standards. Night shift at the front desk, checking people in and out, doing some inventory in the back. I liked the peace and quiet, though. As a little rundown motel on a stretch of isolated highway in Michigan, it gave me a lot of time to read and play computer games on the clock. It also helped that the owner, Frank, didn't seem to care I was a high school dropout with a rap sheet. But on the very first day, I felt that something was terribly off. For one, there was the smell. When the wind shifted, the entire parking lot smelled like rotting meat. I ran to close the windows, but even then I could still smell it, seeping in through the HVAC system. The motel is surrounded by deep woods, so I figured maybe we were near the kill grounds of some animal. Or maybe it was just the endless roadkill of deer and possums on the highway. Either way, it was unsettling, and definitely not enjoyable. The other thing that struck me as odd were the guests' rooms. Some of them didn't have windows, and it seemed like that was intentional. I could see the lines in the paint, the seams outlining where windows had once been. When I asked Frank, he told me that some of the guests asked for windowless rooms, that they were in high demand. He didn't elaborate, and honestly, I was a little scared to press him on it. Things went from strange to downright creepy, however, as soon as Frank left. As I got set up at my desk, a woman walked into the room. She was in her 40s maybe, with black hair and very pale skin. As soon as she stepped inside, she locked the door behind her. "Frank left, right?" she asked me. "Yeah," I replied. Who are you?" She introduced herself as Matilda. She'd been working here for a decade, cleaning the motel rooms after the guests checked out. After a few minutes of small talk, she suddenly came up to the counter and lowered her voice. "I want to make sure you're safe around here," she said, glancing back towards the door nervously. "So I need you to listen to me, okay?" My heart dropped. Okay? Whatever you do, don't ask questions. Just check people in, check them out, and mind your own business. And then, you'll be fine." My stomach did a little flip. Okay, so it was that kind of motel. Illegal business of multiple kinds, probably, all being conducted under our dilapidated roof. What if the police come? Will I be arrested too?" She gave me a blank stare. "The police? Say they find evidence of illegal activity in one of the rooms. Will that get me in trouble? I already have shoplifting on my record and can't..." She shook her head. "Don't worry about the police. Just don't ask questions. And don't make eye contact or look at their faces for too long." I swallowed. They don't want witnesses. They don't want me to be able to pick them out of a lineup, I thought. Okay. I won't ask questions, and I won't look at them for too long. Got it. She smiled at me. "You have nothing to worry about." As it turned out, though, I had quite a lot to worry about. That night, I checked in 3 people. They were almost like caricatures. A big, strong guy in sunglasses that looked like he'd stepped right out of The Godfather. A woman dressed to the nines, wearing a more makeup than a clown. A skinny young guy in a hoodie that smelled of something chemical and strange. But I listened to Matilda. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even ask the questions I should have been asking, like when hoodie guy gave me an ID that was clearly fake. Don't ask questions and you'll be fine. I kept repeating that to myself. And I kept my eyes glued to the computer screen, never even glancing up at them. When it hit midnight, I assumed the rest of the night would be smooth sailing. On this lonely stretch of highway, it was unlikely anyone else would check in. I pulled up Minesweeper and played some music on my phone. My peace and quiet, however, was interrupted by the door swinging open. At 2 a.m., I glanced up to see the guy in sunglasses, the guy who looked like he'd stepped out of The Godfather. Oh no, I should have locked the door. I swallowed and kept my eyes glued to the computer screen as he approached. "Can I help you?" I asked, watching him in my peripheral vision. "Do you have any razors for purchase?" I froze. Razors? At 2 a.m.? I instantly got a mental image of him slashing someone up in his room, blood all over the sheets, soaking into the carpet. No, we don't have any razors," I said, keeping my eyes on the computer screen. "Can you just check in the back, please?" I swallowed. I really didn't want to go check. As soon as I turned around, he could do anything. Pull out a gun. Tackle me. Force me into a chokehold and keep me hostage. But refusing him was just as bad, if not worse. It might make him mad. Really mad. I sat there staring at Minesweeper on the screen, weighing my options, paying close attention to him out of the corner of my eye. And that's when I saw it. There was something off about this guy. His sunglasses looked like they were slightly too low on his face, like the eyes they were covering weren't in quite the right place. And not only that, but I couldn't see his eyebrows poking above the frames or the contours of his brow ridge. Everything above the glasses was perfectly flat and smooth, like he had no eye sockets at all. "Can you check in the back, please?" he asked again, his voice taking on an annoyed tone. Yes, sure." I sprung out of the seat and ducked into the back storage area. I quickly glanced over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following me, but he wasn't. I had half a mind to just stay there, hiding out in the back storage room, until I heard his voice calling me. "Did you find them?" He sounded angry, approaching furious. Thankfully, I did find a few packaged razors next to some spare toothbrushes and soap we kept. I grabbed them and handed them over, keeping my eyes trained on the floor. "Thank you," he said, sounding pleased. And that was it. He turned around and left. As soon as the door shut, I ran over and locked it. I closed the blinds and sat back down at the front desk, my heart hammering in my chest. All I could picture were the strange contours of his face. And as I sat there, I realized something. All 3 guests that I'd checked in since the start of my shift, the Godfather guy, the makeup woman, the hoodie guy, had something covering their face or head. I mean, I wasn't exaggerating about the woman having enough makeup for a clown. She was wearing foundation so thick that it cracked around the corners of her eyes and lips, and wore false eyelashes so long they gave the appearance of spider legs. And hoodie guy had kept his hood pulled so tightly over his head that his ears and hair weren't visible. It was like they all had something to hide. Morning couldn't come soon enough. As soon as the day shift workers arrived, I got the hell out of there. I floored it back to my house and slept for a long time, my sleep plagued with nightmares of faceless people and spidery eyelashes. Then it was time to go back to the motel for night number 2. Thankfully, it was a quieter night. Although the vacancy sign glowed brightly in the darkness, no one checked in during my shift. They must have all come earlier, during the day shift. I locked the door, sat down with a cup of coffee, and enjoyed getting some reading done in the quiet. Unfortunately, the quiet didn't last long. Around midnight, I heard a loud slam from outside. I threw my book down and ran over to the window. The door to room 16 was wide open. I looked around. Nobody appeared to be outside. The parking lot and the sidewalk were empty. The room itself was dark. None of the lights were on. I walked over to the computer and looked up the room. To my surprise, no one had booked it for tonight. Should I go out and close the door? I hesitated. It was late. There was no one around, except for the occasional passing car. If someone had broken into that room and then attacked me, there would be no one to hear me scream. So I kept the door locked tight and accessed the security camera feed instead. As I rewound it, I saw what happened. The door had opened, and then a woman had walked out of it. I couldn't see her face, just her long, dark hair. She then disappeared into room 22. I checked room 22 on the computer and saw it was booked to a woman named Cassandra Johnson. I frowned. Looked like Cassandra might be going into our vacant rooms and possibly stealing stuff. Matilda must have forgotten to lock up the room after she cleaned it. I sighed, opened the door, and began walking towards the open room. I thought of knocking on room 22, but then thought better of it. Keep your nose out of other people's business. I'd just lock up room 16 and go back to the lobby, like a good little employee. I walked towards to the open room, but as soon as I got close, a horrible smell wafted out of the room, like something rotting, decaying. My stomach turned. What did Cassandra do in there? Throw up? Stash all her garbage in there? I reached into the darkness of the room. Bracing myself, I flicked on the light. The room looked normal. The bed was made. The carpet was clean. But the smell had only intensified. I pinched my nose as I glanced around, starting to feel nauseous. And then I saw it. There was something on the carpet, just barely poking out from the other side of the bed. What is that? It was tan and folded over itself, like a beige sheet or pillowcase had been bunched up on the other side. But all our sheets were white. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. The smell got even worse as I approached the bed. Nausea washed over me. I forced myself to keep going, pinching my nose, swallowing down the urge to throw up. I peered over the side of the bed and froze. There was a pile of beige, slightly translucent material folded over itself on the other side. But I instantly recognized certain shapes attached to it. Awfully familiar shapes. Like 5 fingers, resembling a glove made of skin, poking out from under one of the folds. It looked like someone had shed their skin. I stepped back, my legs shaking underneath me. No. There's no way. It can't be. I backed away, towards the door, my throat dry. Because it didn't make sense. It didn't even make sense with a horrible crime. There wasn't any blood on it. It hadn't been cut off someone. It was like a snakeskin, clean and perfect, holding the shape of its wearer like a ghost. I ran out of the room and saw, walking towards me down the sidewalk, the woman from room 22. Strands of her dark, straight hair hung over her face. But I could tell, through her hair, that there was something wrong with her face. Her eyes, her lips, were in slightly the wrong position. She strode towards me, fast, her shoes clicking on the pavement. I didn't want to find out what she'd do if she caught me. I whipped around and ran as fast as I could. I could hear her behind me, but I forced myself to go faster and faster until I was inside the lobby. I clicked the lock shut and collapsed in the back room, where she couldn't see me. That's when the whistling started. Just outside the door, I could hear her. Whistling. The source of the sound shifted as she circled the lobby area, looking for a way in. I heard it at the door, then at the back, then through the side windows, then back at the front door. This went on for an hour. Finally, the whistling faded, but I didn't move. I stayed there, huddled in the back storage room, until dawn broke. As soon as the day shift arrived, I booked it out of there as fast as I could. I wanted to quit. With everything I am, I wanted to just walk away. But I needed the money. I already knew how hard it was, finding a job with a rap sheet. It was either go back to the job or face eviction. So I went back. When I got on shift, though, I pulled Matilda aside and told her what I'd seen. I asked her again and again if my life was in danger. Asked her what the hell was going on here. If other people were in danger too. I promise you, as long as you mind your own business, you'll be safe. So that's what I did. I minded my own business. And for the next few days, nothing of note happened. Sure, there were a few people who checked in that were wearing hats or sunglasses or extra makeup, but I just tried to avoid eye contact with them. Tried to keep my head down and my nose out of other people's business. But then came the night of November 14th. It was raining that night. The rain came down in sheets, and every so often I heard a peal of thunder shake the windows. I wasn't expecting anyone to come in that night, as I hadn't seen that many cars driving by on the highway. The rain seemed to keep everybody in. But then I heard a knock. When I looked up, I saw a man staring in the window. A chill ran down my spine. He was wearing a hoodie that hid his head and kept his face mostly in shadow. And he was rather aggressively banging on the window, like he was in a hurry. I grabbed the mace I kept under the counter and slipped it into my pocket. Then I approached the window. "Do you have any vacancies?" he asked in a low voice, barely audible above the pounding rain. The vacancy sign glowed brightly behind him. There's no way he could have missed it. "Yeah, come on in," I said, unlocking the door with one hand and gripping the mace in my pocket with the other. He stepped inside. Rain dripped off his jacket and onto the floor. I barely glanced at him, turning around and walking back around the counter. Then I sat down at the computer, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. In my peripheral vision, I could see him, leaning over the counter, his face only about a foot or two from mine. So close that I could smell the stale, mothball odor coming off his clothes. So close I could hear drops of water plopping onto the counter from his sleeve. "Can you go faster?" he asked, his voice raspy in his throat. "Sorry, sir. I'm going fast as I can," I replied, my heart starting to pound. "It's an old computer." My fingers slipped on the mouse as I rushed to click the buttons. "I don't have all day," he growled, looming even closer to me. I wanted to look at him. My eyes were itching to glance up at the man that was 6 inches from my face. But I forced myself to stare at the screen. Whatever the hell was going on here, I was not going to be a witness. I was not going to look up and find myself face to face with a Smith & Wesson. "Your name?" I asked. As soon as the words came out of my mouth, I froze. I needed a name to book the room. That's all. But maybe he wouldn't see it that way. Maybe I wasn't supposed to ask for names. Maybe that was part of Frank's understanding with certain guests. Thankfully, nothing happened. After a second of hesitation, he replied, "Daniel Jones." The name struck me as fake. Common first name, common last name. But who even cared at this point? I typed his name into the system and completed the booking process. He paid for the room in cash, which was another unnerving detail, but I tried not to worry about it. I turned my back and took a key off the hook. "Room 7, I said, handing it to him. He thanked me, and then waited by the door. I waited for a minute, then 2. But he didn't leave. "Do you need something?" I asked, careful not to make eye contact. "Can you escort me to my room?" Oh, hell no. There was no way I could go out there, in the middle of the night, with this creepy guy. That was like a death sentence. I glanced out the window and spotted his car, a beat-up sedan, in one of the nearby parking spaces. The murder scenario played out in my head. Shoves me into the hotel room, kills me, sticks my body in the trunk, throws it in the middle of the woods, or maybe worse. Maybe my skin would end up crumpled on the floor of one of the rooms. Maybe he'd take my form, or turn me into something that sheds its skin like a snake. That has eyes too low on its face, or no eye sockets at all. And the longer I looked at him, in the corner of my eye, the more I noticed how unsavory he looked. There were smears of dirt on his sleeves and on the hem of his pants. "Like he's been digging a grave," the voice in my head added. His face, half hidden in shadow, was sunken and gaunt. His jaw was covered in gray stubble, and his teeth were a horrible shade of grayish yellow. Can't you just go yourself? I have something that I need to do here. My boss is going to be mad. You can take 2 minutes to walk me to my room, damn it." I sat there in stunned silence. He sounded furious. My heart pounded in my ears. "Okay," I said finally. My fingers curled around the mace in my pocket, and then I joined him by the door. "I'll walk you to your room." He didn't thank me. He just grabbed the door and swung it open, nearly letting it swing back in my face. I stepped out into the pouring rain with him. The parking lot was a lake, and our feet sloshed loudly through the water. The cold water seeped through my sneakers, and I shivered. I followed the man to his car, staying a good 15 feet away. He popped the trunk, and I held my breath. But thankfully, there was only a duffel bag inside. He hoisted it on his shoulder and started for room 7. I followed him at a distance, staying several feet away, watching him fidget with the key. "You got a lot of other people staying here right now?" he asked, as he slid the key into the lock. "Some," I replied. "Not great weather for it." "Not really. The storm's supposed to clear tomorrow. It'll be good weather then." Wow, this is taking a while, I thought to myself. That's when I looked down at his hands and noticed that he wasn't really trying to get into his room. He was just inserting the key, pausing, and then pulling it out, over and over again. He was stalling for time. He was keeping me here, on purpose. I looked up from his hands, just in time to see him staring at me. His blue eyes were intense, studying me. I wanted to run away. Every inch of me was screaming to get out of there. but the guy had 6 inches on me and was really thin. He'd probably catch me in seconds. I was never much of a runner. I slipped my hand in my pocket, curling my fingers around the mace. "Do you need help getting into your room?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'm going to go back to the front desk," I said, taking a step back. As soon as I said that, he froze. His eyes widened as he stared at me. Slowly, he shook his head, his lips stretching into a grimace that revealed his yellowed teeth. "Don't go," he growled, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Stay exactly where you are." I leapt into action. I whipped the mace out of my pocket and held it in front of me, pointing it right at him. "Don't get any closer." My finger hovered over the trigger, and then I heard it. Someone was whistling. Behind me, somewhere in the rain. The song cut through the pattering raindrops like a knife. It was the same eerie tune that woman had whistled a few days ago. "I'm sorry," the man said quietly, his blue eyes locked on mine. "But I needed bait." I stared at him. My brain couldn't even process what he was saying. Bait? I took a stumbling step back. The whistling grew louder. I whipped around. Through the rain, I could see someone walking through the parking lot, barely lit by the flickering street lamp. The mace fell from my hands and clattered to the ground. Then I turned and ran as fast as I could towards the lobby. The whistling stopped, and then I could hear loud, splashing footsteps growing louder with every second behind me. I swung the door open, slammed it shut, and turned the lock. I pulled the blinds down over the window. Panting, I parted them with my fingertips and peered out into the night. There was a woman standing in the parking lot, the same woman I had seen a week ago. Her hair and clothes were drenched with rain, but she was smiling, this big, lopsided grin that sent chills down my spine. And her eyes were strange, wide and wild, incredibly light blue. In the darkness, it almost looked like she didn't have irises at all. Just 2 pinholes for pupils staring right at my door. No. She took a step forward. I ran over to my desk, grabbed my cell phone, started dialing 911. Come on. 911, what's your emergency? I'm at the Greenbrier Motel, and there's this guy and this weird woman. Thump. I was cut off by a loud thump nearby. I ran to the window and peered out. The man who'd booked room 7 was running towards the woman. He was holding something up in the air, a short dagger gleaming silver in the rain. "He's attacking her!" I screamed into the phone. The woman's face changed, her features twisted, her grin crept up to her eyes. Her arms crackled and stretched. She blinked, and her eyes turned pure white. Her body twisted unnaturally at the waist so that she was facing the man. With fast, jolted movements, she leapt at him. Within seconds, he was dead. She stood on all fours above him, her knees bent the wrong way, her fingers far too long. With another horrible crackling sound, her neck stretched out 2 feet long, twisting and serpentine. And then she looked at me. I leapt away from the window with a scream. "What's happening?" the operator asked me. "Sir, please tell me what's happening." I opened my mouth, tried to speak, but only a squeaking sound came out. By the time I made it back over to the window, the woman was standing there, looking down at her kill. She looked normal. Then she stepped over his body and walked towards the rooms. To my horror, she pulled out a key and opened room 22. Then she disappeared inside. The police arrived a few minutes later. In strings of gibberish, I begged them to check room 22. That something horrible was lurking inside. But then they knocked on the door. A completely normal-looking woman opened it. I watched from the lobby. I couldn't hear that much of their conversation over the pouring rain. But they weren't arresting her, weren't accusing her. They seemed to just be having a friendly conversation, asking her what she'd seen. Then they thanked her and came back to me. "We'll need to see the security tapes from tonight, please," the officer said, in an accusing tone. But when I showed them the tapes, they got quiet. One of the officers made a call to someone, saying something about an infestation. The other two officers ushered me out into the lobby, their faces grim. They told me not to leave as they talked among themselves in hushed voices in the corner of the room. Then they approached. "You didn't see anything tonight," the tall man said, leaning in close. "You got that?" But what about—" "Listen to me very carefully," he interrupted, lowering his voice. "You didn't see anything, just like you never shoplifted in your life." "What? You understand me?" he asked. The silence stretched out between us. "Yeah, I got it," I said, my voice wavering. "I didn't see anything. I left the motel and never went back. I planned to never speak of what I saw, to keep my mouth shut, just like they told me to. But after losing many nights of sleep, I realized that I need to warn people. I need to warn you. I can't have another person dying because of these things, whatever they are. So, I beg you, if you're driving through Michigan and see that there's a vacancy at the Greenbrier Motel, keep driving